Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. I am a senior associate at LSE Ideas. Today marks our 33rd LSE Ideas Russia-Ukraine Dialogue, a series that we launched in the aftermath of the February 2022 escalation of the war. We're part funded by PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. Welcome to today's Russia-Ukraine dialogue, where we aim to provide valuable input into the upcoming Russia-Ukraine conference that will be held in London just over a week from now. The situation in Ukraine demands our urgent attention as the country grapples with significant challenges that have left a lasting impact on its people and economy. Before we commence this session, I'd like to dedicate our discussion to the thousands of victims affected by the devastating destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric station in the Kherson region. The haunting images of Ukrainians in desperate circumstances serves as a poignant reminder of the profound and enduring impact caused by the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. The statistics we have before us are both staggering and disheartening. As reported by Ukraine's Ministry of Social Policy, the number of internally displaced people exceeded 5 million in 2022, while over 8 million Ukrainians have fled altogether. This mass displacement has placed immense strains on social systems and highlighted the need for comprehensive solutions. Furthermore, Ukraine has experienced a sharp rise in unemployment, with NBU data indicating a jump from approximately 10% at the end of 2021 to a concerning 20 to 26% in 2022. Furthermore, Ukraine's real GDP fell by a staggering 29.1% in 2022, a significant blow to the country's economic stability and development. Adding to these challenges is the immense toll on infrastructure caused by Russia's full-scale invasion. The documented damage have reached a staggering $147.5 billion as of April 2023, leaving Ukraine's vital infrastructure in desperate need of repairs and reconstruction. In response to these immense challenges, Ukraine presented a comprehensive recovery plan in Lugano in July 2022, last year. This ambitious plan, estimated to cost $750 billion, seeks to rebuild the nation and achieve an annual GDP growth rate of over 7%. However, the scale of investment required is immense, and it begs the crucial question: how will Ukraine finance its recovery? As we approach the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London, it becomes imperative to discuss how the country's economy can be restructured to support these ambitious goals. The restructuring process must take into account the financial needs for defense, social support, and the increased expenditure resulting from unprovoked aggression and the ongoing war with Russia. Ukraine's vision of doubling its GDP over the next decade, reaching a range of $285 to $350 billion, presents both an opportunity and a significant challenge. To discuss these issues, I would like to welcome three very distinguished guests. Firstly, I'd like to welcome back to the Russia-Ukraine Dialogues Natalia Shapoval, head of KSE Institute at the Kiev School of Economics. Her policy research focuses on public procurement, the cost of HIV AIDS, the financial burden of healthcare costs, and private sector-driven growth strategies. Welcome back. I'd also like to welcome Gavin Gray, the mission chief for Ukraine at the International Monetary Fund, and in his capacity, he leads policy discussions with the Ukrainian authorities. In his 17-year career at the IMF, he's worked on a diverse range of countries, including Iraq, Ireland, Latvia, Pakistan, and South Africa. And I should also mention that he studied at the London School of Economics. Welcome, Gavin. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Luke Cooper. He's an associate professorial research fellow at the Conflict and Civicness Research Group, based also at LSE Ideas, and he is the director of PeaceRep's Ukraine program. Welcome to all three of you. I'm going to turn first to Natalia, so please unmute for me. Natalia, why don't you kick us off by telling us, by focusing a little bit on what has changed in terms of Ukraine's economy since February 2022. Can you provide us with a brief overview of macroeconomic changes? Thank you and welcome back, Natalia.
Yes, thank you. Exactly as you mentioned, the new goal and what the economy is working for is in the first place to win the war, and therefore the major expenditures, the focus of the industry is on the financing of the war, on diverting all the budget finances to the military sector. So this is a huge change, and we cannot reflect, this change of using all our productive capacities, people, talent, best people on this. But because that's immense, and if you look into raw numbers here, we will see that economy dropped 30%, and the unemployment rate is also a similar magnitude. As you mentioned, a lot of people left Ukraine. So we had a labor force of around 17 million people. And you say that 5 million people left, and half of them approximately are working age population, women mostly. Then we have almost between 1 and 2 million of people who are directly or indirectly engaged in the war process, either as mobilized military or volunteers, etc. So the loss of this human capital who can work on the regular economy, so to say, is much smaller. We lost around 35% of the exports last year of goods, and this is because of the ports primarily. Ports were supporting more than 60% of the whole Ukrainian trade. So blockade, especially before any kind of grain deal was set, was really tremendous impact. Now it's recovering, and hopefully with new negotiations, it's going to recover even more. Then, of course, imports dropped, but some lines of imports, of course, increased, like military goods imports. So the economy is kind of, on the one hand, is a very difficult situation. On the other hand, it's actually keeping very well and much better than you could imagine with the destruction like this. So as you said, we have almost $150 billion of direct destruction to infrastructure. We have like 150,000 of houses destroyed. And this is huge. And with this, economy and people continue working. And basically, Ukraine, if we wouldn't have the need to finance the war, we would have enough basically to support all our social needs, but now it's not the case, because we have the second budget, the same amount that we were regularly spending on the regular budget needs, now goes every month to support the military. So this is the most difficult part, and therefore Ukraine needs a lot of international support. So government collects money, sends almost all of that to military expenditure, and then what donors send to the government goes to all kind of social support. Last year, it was almost $46 billion of international support. This year, right now, the commitments are something around $36 billion, but probably it's going to be bigger because the deficit of the budget is growing, and as we see with Kakhovka and a lot of other calamities, that the situation might get very difficult. The goal is, of course, to end the war as quick as possible with counteroffensive. The strategy is to get all military support, all sanctions, everything, push back, and get to recover a more constructive process. So this is a quick summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And I bet when you first started studying economics, you did not think about that intimate relationship that you experience now between the economy and this existential threat, this military threat. Thank you also for just mentioning the shifts in budgets also. And I'm going to turn to Gavin now. Gavin, of course, the IMF plays a significant role also in Ukraine. How has February 2022 and subsequent months impacted on Ukraine's government budget, its ability to pay debts, and Ukraine's balance of payments and financial needs? Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I can build on the points which Natalia made. I think, as she rightly pointed out, the economic impact of the war has been large and severe, and the public finances have borne the brunt of this. Maybe to give you a few numbers, before the war, public expenditure in Ukraine was about 40% of GDP, 40% of national income. In 2022, it reached 70% of national income. That's an enormous increase, and it is primarily for the reasons which Natalia mentioned, the need for security spending. Also, there has been additional need for social spending because of the large number of internally displaced people. But unfortunately, primarily the authorities have had to cut back capital expenditure. Anything else which they have done has been reduced dramatically. What has been, I would say, in what is a very difficult situation, what has been surprising and has been a support is the fact that tax revenues have held up well. And this is partly, there's been a solidarity principle at work. Also, of course, there's been a transition of the workforce more towards the public sector, so people have to pay their taxes. But roughly that's been about 36% of GDP. But the end result has been a very large budget deficit. Pre-war, Ukraine was running public deficits on the order of 4% of GDP. In 2022, it was 26 if you exclude the role of grants. So that's enormous. So the interesting question has been, how has this been financed? And it has been, and this is maybe one thing which distinguishes Ukraine from other historical cases of conflicts, is there has been substantial external support, partly in the form of grants, partly in the form of loans, and the Ukrainian people have been extraordinarily resilient. But this has been one factor which has enabled the authorities to execute their budget, continue undertaking core functions. Now, in addition to that external financing, in 2022 there was monetary financing from the central bank, and that's and I'll come back to that in a second. You asked also about a balance of payments and debt. So public debt has gone up enormously. The Ukrainian authorities, to their credit, continued servicing their debt in the early stages of the war. Over the summer last year, debt standstills were organized for the commercial debt and the official debt, and that's given a bit of relief. And there will be, we're expecting in next year for there to be a more full-scale restructuring of the debt. Maybe just a few words about the sort of, I mean, that was 2022, but the sort of what we see happening right now, and also I'll cover the balance of payments. So as Natalia mentioned, the economy contracted by 29% last year. What is surprising and interesting is how resilient the economy has been in the last few months. So this year we expect growth of somewhere between 1% to 3%, and that reflects the fact that the authorities have been very resilient in dealing with the attacks on energy infrastructure, which everyone expected would have had a large economic impact in addition to the social impact. Budget deficit is likely to be something very similar again this year for same sort of factors. External support will continue to be needed in large amounts, and we'll have to assess the impact indeed of the tragic destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. The one final point I would say is in terms of balance of payments. So trade deficit has been quite large because of the loss of export channels. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was a real boon the end of last year. For 23, I think the picture is going to be a bit more difficult because, of course, there's also been the restrictions imposed by certain countries in the European Union. So balance of payments will still remain quite weak. But overall, I would say for 23, slightly better picture, economy picking up, inflation is coming down quite sharply, which of course is quite good when you think about poverty, and I think that's basically it. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. That would really complement what Natalia was talking about also, and we'll dive more deeply into some of those issues that you mentioned. Luke, Natalia also mentioned, she sprinkled in a few facts there also about some of the physical damage to Ukraine. But I would like to ask you, and just for our audience, Luke recently went to Ukraine also for some more research there. But Luke, can you provide us with a brief overview of the current estimates of physical damage that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine since February 2022 specifically? Thank you, Luke.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you all and be on such a panel with such great guests for this important discussion. As you say, I've recently got back from Kiev, and I suppose the striking thing about being a foreign visitor in Kiev is that you really see the level of societal resilience firsthand. And it underlines, I guess, the point that there is enormous geographical unevenness in the physical damage that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine since the February 2022 full-scale invasion. And that's based on the obvious metric of proximity to the fighting, either ongoing frontline hostilities or in the legacy of the battles of 2022. So you can think in a way of the geography of Ukraine as a series of kind of misshapen concentric lines stretching from the parts of Kiev Oblast attacked in the Battle of Kiev in April 2022, Irpin, Bucha, moving up and along areas affected by the invasion that came from the north at the time through Belarus, and then moving eastwards to Sumy, to Kharkiv, and down to the Russian-occupied east and south. So in that geographical picture, we have extremes present in a way. Western Ukraine not significantly impacted. Bombed buildings in Kiev itself still few and far between, with the air defenses holding. Then at the other extreme of that picture, you have places like Bakhmut, which we've all seen the horrendous images and footage that are circulating online. It's completely destroyed, it seems. And with within those extremes, places like Kherson and Kharkiv that are still very much on the front line of the ongoing hostilities. And that geographical unevenness then feeds into different sectoral impacts on the economy by virtue of where industries tend to be located or their level of mobility. So the IT services sector, as people watching may know, relatively unimpacted, and the type of work it's doing makes it highly mobile. And then at the other extreme on that level, steel has been impacted hugely. The famous mills at Mariupol, one completely destroyed, one heavily damaged and now under Russian occupation. There's a remaining steel mill in Zaporizhzhia, but it exports through Odessa. And as Natalia was saying, lack of security for that trade is an ongoing major issue. Then by contrast, a lot of the iron sector is concentrated in central Ukraine and is less damaged. The construction materials sector is geographically distributed across the whole of Ukraine, and that directly, as we've been saying, affects its level of damage. So it's thought that it's only had damage to around 15% of its assets. So you can see, I think, in that picture, the challenges that are at work here: trade route dislocation hitting exports, underutilization of the assets that remain as that crunch in domestic demand occurs. And I think we can come back to and talk about that a bit more later. And then you've also got, as Natalia also mentioned, this labor supply problem due in part to external displacement, and even in the context of cripplingly high unemployment, lots of the skilled blue collar workforce are serving in the armed forces. So there's a disproportionate impact of the war on the labor supply to Ukraine's underlying industrial capacity. So you have these combinations of multiple different crises in a way existing on top of one another.
Thank you, Luke. And I think the picture that you paint is that the higher the level of security in a particular area, the greater the ability, obviously, of Ukraine to reconstruct. Because, and I think Gavin sort of alluded to this, But we are in a unique situation because Ukraine it continues to be pummeled on a daily basis while reconstruction is also happening at the same time. Which is also something that's been funded from the outside. This reconstruction process to a certain extent. So we are in unique territory here. Let's go back to Natalia. Natalia, what are the key priority sectors that Ukraine will have to focus on for reconstruction purposes?
So there are several reconstructions. One is something that we have to do right now. So the economy with this kind of infrastructure damage cannot function properly. So there are actual like people and communities in very hard need. For example, like the one side of the victory and the occupation of territories, like in Kherson or Kharkiv or even Kiev, Chernihiv region, is that like we get the territory back and people get into like more safety. But at the same time, the dark side of it is that these territories require really heavy reconstruction already now. We run some like small surveys, not to bother people too much, but in these occupied territories, and we see that many of them lack basic electricity, water supply. There are some ecological damages that led to the situation when the water disappears from the kind of the ponds, etc. So all kind of issues. Then in some localities, the houses are really heavily destroyed, like 90% of the housing can be destroyed, and people still have to get back there. We know about big cities, and even Bucha is pretty big city, and the level of damage there is huge, but as proportion to the whole city is not that huge. But some other places, like smaller village Mashun, also Kiev region, or in Kherson, now we will have more names, but Posad Pokrovsky village or something, they would have like almost every house destroyed, and people still need to live there. So the first reconstruction is actually about settlements that were severely damaged during the occupation or shelling nearby. And this is one thing, like whatever is needed, someone needs electricity, some economy gets running. This happens in the territories, a lot of occupied territories were basically agrarian regions. And it means that the mining that Russian did during this period is detrimental for the economy. So basically, there are a lot of efforts needed now to keep the economy, like or create some economy out of nothing in these settlements. So this is one thing. There are different estimates how much it can cost, but I think more or less consistently, the government was telling the figure in Lugano, but also going to be talking about something similar in London, is something between 14 to 17 billion dollars. These are the estimates what's needed for this fast recovery needs. Then there is the second like big reconstruction, and it also probably should start now because the economy needs more fundamental sources to run. And this implies basically modernization of the economy of Ukraine. And in this regard, I think the energy, especially green energy, this is something that Ukraine has to, for different reasons, rejuvenate. And because some of our energy system was destroyed, because we need new ways of running energy systems during, like with such a neighbor as Russia, for example, more decentralized networks, but also because it's a big deal in the whole world that the energy should become greener. We should move to renewable energy sources. And for Ukraine, it means that a lot of like heating, central heating infrastructure, a lot of coal mines, should be restructured and new businesses should be opened. Then another part of this is that Ukraine should create more joint opportunities for Ukraine and the EU to store gas. and maybe hydrogen even in the current gas pipes, because that's for the upcoming years going to be still a huge source of energy for the continent, and because we need to replace Russia and have like more security around this. Agriculture is always the case in point. It's not about, the value added or anything people should eat. Like the global south depends to a large degree on what's going on in Ukraine, on this market in the region. So it's going to be a case in point for sure. But then, like, Ukraine needs to rebuild the industry. For example, our biggest industry, like metallurgy, was almost destroyed. Like export is very small right now, and there is no way that anyone would, give Ukraine money for old way of doing metallurgy, with a lot of CO2 emission. So that should be something new, and that's gonna, energy and agro and this metallurgical traditional industries for Ukraine that would create a demand also for other things. Then construction for sure. There is no way that there will be no development in this industry given the volume of the roads and houses destruction. But then kind of most of economy of Ukraine already is and probably gonna be small and medium enterprises, all kind of IT, creative industry, small farmers, textiles, etc. And there is no kind of, one big thing. It's just the overall environment and opportunities should be there for them kind of to survive and support the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. I think that's a great overview also. We'll have some follow-up questions specifically on energy and agriculture, I think, and some of the other issues that you pointed out. But before we do that, let's go to Gavin again. Gavin, of course, Natalia mapped out some of these dire needs for Ukraine, which will require some serious finance. And I know a lot of these issues bleed more into what the World Bank is doing rather than the IMF. But your involvement, of course, is also quite significant. Recently, the IMF approved a 48-month extended arrangement under the so-called Extended Fund Facility, the EFF, with an amount of approximately $15.6 billion US. Now, through the new program, the IMF is supporting a two-phased approach in Ukraine. What are the main goals of the new approach, and what do you have installed for phase two? Because we'll tackle for phase one, we'll tackle phase two separately. Thank you, Gavin.
Yes, thank you very much. What I would say at the outset is that the IMF program is part of a wider and deeper international effort to ensure that the Ukrainian authorities have the resources they need to ensure that the core functions of the state can operate over the medium term. The total package size is $115 billion, of which the IMF is providing 15.6. There will be significant donor support. In addition, the debt restructuring, which I referred to earlier, will help provide relief. It provides flow relief to contribute to this package. What is the objective? I would say all international institutions operating in Ukraine have grappled with the task: how do we support a country which is operating in the context of a war of this nature? This has been, I would say, an intrinsic feature of this program, is that we've, because the level of uncertainty is very high, we've designed a program which should work not only in the current baseline scenario, but also if circumstances are worse. And the donors have indicated their willingness to provide additional financing if needed in that scenario. But broadly speaking, the goal, as with any IMF program, is to support economic and financial stability, to help ensure that the authorities can meet their budget targets, continue bringing down inflation, help ensure that the financial sector it continues to be stable. That is the fundamental goal. In addition, debt sustainability is being restored, and that's a really important feature for a country which has suffered a shock like this. And in particular, because the authorities want to encourage new lenders to come in for the reconstruction projects, which Natalia mentioned too. So stability is really very beneficial in circumstances where there are fundamentally high risks. Turning to the, and maybe the third, I'd say the third goal I should mention is that there will be reforms under the program which will help complement Ukraine's aspiration to join the European Union, which is a really important anchor for future reforms. In terms of the near term, macroeconomic stabilization remains really important. So the challenge in 2023 is to keep the budget on track. This will require the authorities to avoid cutting taxes and to sustain tax revenues. And there's a burden sharing perspective here, is that the international community is willing to support Ukraine, but Ukraine needs to play its part as well, and continuing to collect taxes is part of that. The final point I'd mention is an area which we will be working on is governance and measures to combat corruption. There were and reforms expected of this year include the return of asset declarations, steps to strengthen AML CFT, anti-money laundering, and also enhancing the autonomy of the anti-corruption prosecutor's office. And just the final point I make is that governance and steps to strengthen governance very much tie into efforts to raise resources for recovery and reconstruction, because the international community wants to know that those resources will be well spent. Those are reforms which we know the population wants, but I think it's also something which the international community is very supportive of. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. And I think if I understand correctly, phase one is for this year, and next year, phase two will be the subsequent years. But we'll circle back to phase two specifically during the next round. Let's first go to Luke. Luke, Ukraine is still experiencing a severe war-induced recession, like we all know. What is your view of the role of the state in promoting economic recovery and reconstruction? I know you have a very particular view on this matter, so I'd be keen to hear your insight on this. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Ukraine should have had to go to the IMF. I think that's a shame. That's the first thing. Ukraine should have been offered a equivalent of the US Lend-Lease agreement by other partners, which are based on aid and solidarity and aid rather than loans. So, and that's not a criticism of the IMF. I just don't think that Ukraine should have been in a position to have to go to the lender of last resort, because there should have been a recognition of mutual interest and mutual solidarity with Ukraine. So I just wanted to state that as my position and concern here. The other thing I wonder, though perhaps in partial contradiction to that statement, is that I do welcome the fact that the IMF agreement does commit Ukraine not to take any measures to cut taxes, as Gavin has said. I think this is really important because tax revenue mobilization is critical to Ukraine retaining sovereignty over its war aims. And part of that is about tax revenue mobilization driving down the informal economy too. And this is a role that the state, of course, can play, Leon, to pivot to your question now. The state can make sure that labour and payroll inspections of workplaces are carried out. They were suspended at the start of the war. I think that was a mistake. The state should be making sure that businesses are paying their taxes at the workplace level, that VAT is going in. And the 2020 report by the National Bank of Ukraine put the size of the informal economy, so that part of it that isn't paying its taxes, at about 25%, something in the region of 25%. So by reducing the size of that economy, then Ukraine will directly gain more taxation revenue. And the more taxation revenue that it has, of course, for its security, the more sovereignty it has over its war efforts. So I think, you know, this tax mobilization and debt sustainability question is really a matter of social policy as much as it is fiscal policy. What kind of partnership agreements do you have between, for instance, trade unions and employer organizations that ensures everyone is pulling together to deliver for the Ukrainian war effort? And then I think the other thing that's really important to say, and you hinted at this in your question, Leon, is that, you know, markets don't function effectively in war environments. And this is because the very simple impacts that war has on conventional market and business decisions, that the risks associated with investments simply become too great. There's always a risk of investments. That's how capitalist markets work. But the risk becomes so great that investment seizes up, it contracts very radically. And that means that the state has to intervene to offset the collapse in private sector demand and investment. And then does the state have the fiscal and administrative capacity to intervene at the level that is needed in Ukraine at the moment? I would say it probably doesn't have that capacity, but it could do, and it could look at ways to raise taxes, increase taxes in order to fund its war effort too. When I was in Kiev, and this I'll finish on this point, I visited an elevator factory that was in the Kiev Oblast region, and they told me that 80% of their current business was with the government of Ukraine, and that's a classic war economy dynamic. So market investors not investing in construction in the same way, the state has to intervene, and that creates a real burden and responsibility on the state to drive forward economic growth, because the scale of the contraction in 2022 was so great. Ukraine is risking a lost generation in terms of its economic development, and it has a chance now, a moment of opportunity, to utilize war-induced demand to deliver rapid growth. So I think the projections around modest growth this year are probably accurate at the moment, but unfortunately I don't think that should be, we should just accept that, if you like. I think we should be looking at innovative mechanisms that hopefully could deliver much higher rapid levels of economic growth.
Thank you for those points also, and I welcome all the panelists, if you have dissenting opinions, to voice those when it's your turn to speak again, so feel free to do so. We encourage that. Natalia, let's go back to you. One of the things that you pointed out is of course the big issue with regards to the agriculture sector. Can you explain to us viewers, to our viewers from an economic perspective, what is the significance of Ukraine's agricultural sector? What are the major obstacles in the agri sector, and how critical is it for Ukraine's recovery to regain also unhindered access to the Black Sea? Thank you, Natalia.
So basically, Ukrainian agriculture first has, this food security importance. In some kind of crops, Ukraine is in top 5 global producers. For Ukrainian economy, it's all these sectors like metallurgy, agriculture, they together were like almost 1/3 of the economy. Also, it's kind of a huge part of our territory that is agricultural land, and beside the big agri holdings, these are also a lot of small farmers or people who are working on their farms on their own. So it's kind of affects a huge part of the population. What we observe right now is that with almost 1/3 of the territory of Ukraine is at risk of being mined. It's a tricky number. In order to establish like this number correctly, someone should run a very good non-technical survey, or sometimes even technical survey with specific equipment to identify exactly what kind of land might be contaminated and with what. And of course, it hasn't been done for this all territory of Ukraine that was near front lines or occupied at some point of times. But in general, it all is in risk, and the mining goes very slowly. And of course, it affects a huge part of the land of Ukraine. Then this catastrophe with Kakhovka is another huge impact on the southern lands, on several southern regions of Ukraine that might not have any chance, to recover their agriculture for a while. So this is big, and what happens is that with some grain that Ukrainian farmers and products that Ukrainian farmers were not able to export, this crop is lost. And in many cases, this crop was a collateral for the loans. So they have the debt, but they don't have kind of the way how to repay this debt. They use some of the governmental programs to do so, but fundamentally, it's not kind of sustainable way of doing business. They cannot crop again and become businesses again. So a lot of small farmers are really hugely affected. And in territories like Kherson, majority of land is not basically being planted with anything for the second year. So, and in such places like Kherson specifically, like without agriculture, food processing and everything around this doesn't have any sense. Even transportation, logistics, the gas station, everything has really less and less of business. It's not affecting the excess of food in Ukraine in no way. So Ukraine has like a big exporter. So there is no this impact, but of course it has impact for the like the global situation and the importance in Africa, for example, or Middle Eastern countries. So what happened is that Ukrainian agribusinesses started running more and more non-performing loans. I'm not sure that we already can see everything in the central bank reports, but even in the current reports, the non-performing loans among the agribusinesses is like around 10 percentage points higher than before the war. And I feel like it might be more, and it's going to be more with time, if, for example, farmers will not be able to plant again because of the mines. So at the same time, agribusiness is a huge exporter. So it influences our trade balance and access to kind of dollars in a very direct way. Of course, right now, as Gavin said, the macro financial situation is okay. And even though we have a trade deficit and our balance is not super healthy, but the situation is keeping up. But if it continues, the situation will worsen with macro. All kind of programs and ways to support agribusinesses and small businesses in these deoccupied territories that can do something, and in many cases this is exactly some simple agro, are really critical to maintain this sector and a lot of people on the float. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and just on the trade routes and how those have been affected, those of course have been tremendously affected by this conflict. I read about lines that are 50 kilometers long of some of these trucks trying to cross the border, exporting some of your goods. So of course, opening up these the Black Sea route, of course, will remain fundamental for the coming months and years to come. Hopefully not years, but yes. Let's go back to Gavin. Gavin, earlier you talked about a number of structural reforms and things that will take place during phase one of this new the EFF. Can you elaborate on phase two and your expectations for that particular phase? Thank you, Gavin.
This is a harder question to answer because, of course, we don't know how the war will end exactly. But I can give you a sense of the things which we think will be on the radar screen. First and most importantly, assuming that there is a start of formal negotiations with the European Union on accession, then that would unleash a process of institutional change across all public institutions in Ukraine and across society as a whole. And ultimately, we know from the experience of other countries, the first wave of Central and East European countries, is that it's a very demanding process, but ultimately something which is very positive in terms of helping establish the rule of law, create clarity about laws and institutions, and develop a level playing field, which will encourage, which will ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises in Ukraine are on an equal footing with connected parties, and also that foreign investors feel that they can come into a market where they're treated fairly. So I'd say that's contextual information, and in that scenario, the IMF certainly will play its part in helping the authorities continue to strengthen institutions. The second point I'd mention, which is related to that, is on reconstruction. Reconstruction will not be achieved overnight. We know today that a war of this magnitude will require years and decades for recovery to take place. A lot of the conversation so far has focused on the financial resources required on that, but I think one should also think about absorption capacity constraints, including the public institutions. I'm talking now of issues like public procurement, governance, accounting, transparency. Ukraine has actually made quite good progress on some of these issues, including on transparency through the Prozoro website, but there's certainly a long way to go in other areas, and that I think will be that will take some time to get right. Third point I'd mention is the banking sector. So the banking sector has been stabilized during the war. Banks are operating normally. People can withdraw their deposits. Branches are open, which is actually a great achievement in the war. But the banking sector will need to be assessed properly after the end of the war, and there may be a need for recapitalization. And I think after the war, the challenge will be to bring it back to where it was before the war, where there should be institutions which have a capacity to lend and support businesses. And I think the final thing I'd mention is energy sector reform. So that the reality is that energy prices are well below market levels. At some stage, to reduce the burden on the state, then Ukraine, like many other countries, would need to transition to a mode where energy prices are gradually brought up to market levels. But programs are put in place to ensure that poor people, pensioners, vulnerable groups are protected during that. And that will be that's quite a challenging reform, but it'll be very important to help ensure that the resources of the state are used effectively. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm definitely going to circle back to you regarding risks also, because you did mention that phase 2 is very hard to predict what's going to happen there, and as I say, it becomes harder and harder to predict the future, to make predictions, especially about the future, right? So a lot hinges on what happens in the coming months, but we'll talk about risks momentarily. Let's first go back to Luke. Luke, now, given you recently, of course, visited Ukraine, can you provide us with an overview of the current business environment, especially with regards to recovery efforts and the primary needs?
Yeah, sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, business environment broadly on business investment is very, very dependent on state intervention. So I think the question going forward is whether the state is able to leverage sufficient resources in terms of capital and labor to really intervene on a very large scale in the supply and demand crisis that the Ukrainian economy is currently experiencing. A supply crisis driven by physical destruction to assets, and a supply crisis driven by the availability of labor in key sectors that are critical to reconstruction. And then at the same time, as we mentioned, you have the demand crisis on top of that as well. And what I want to emphasize in the run into the Ukraine Recovery Conference next year is that, sorry, next week, excuse me, not next year, there will also be one next year, but the one happening in London next week, is that both Natalia and Gavin at different points in today's discussion have pointed to this question of the balance of payments challenge for Ukraine in 2023 and the uncertainty around it due to trade dislocation. I think the key thing the Ukrainian government can do is look at potentially cost-free mechanisms that it can utilize to grow and expand its domestic economy. So at the Ukraine Recovery Conference, next week, there will be a big emphasis on global private sector engagement in Ukraine's recovery. I think there will be lots of big numbers talked about in terms of that engagement. I just want to put into that discussion that we need to be clear about the businesses that are orientating to the Ukraine recovery discussion and the business case they have for orientating. This isn't an attack on those businesses, it's just being clear about it. And broadly, they will be people that want to sell services and goods into the Ukrainian market. And that raises a challenge for Ukrainian domestic producers, because obviously they're going to find themselves competing for procurement contracts with the government in particular, with companies that have a clear advantage because they're operating in peace conditions at home. So there isn't going to be a level playing field when it comes to those procurement contracts. And so what I would like to see is the Ukrainian government introducing something akin to the Biden administration's Buy American policy, which explicitly prioritizes and advantages American domestic producers when it comes to government tendering. And I think there would be, or there is at least a winnable case for that internationally, because of for Ukraine to persuade allies and donor countries and partners that it needs to do this because of the exceptional and unique circumstances inside the Ukrainian domestic economy. So if it's one thing that the European Commission and the European Union don't like Biden administration's Buy American policy, let's park that and push it to one side. In the Ukrainian case, there's a clear moral and economic case for introducing preferential procurement policy towards Ukraine's domestic economy. And I think if there's a discussion around that, around the London Ukraine Recovery Conference, I know that lots of leading figures in the Ukrainian government have recently indicated that they're very positive towards this proposal that has been made by USAID Economic Resilience Activity and Ukraine Industry Expertise and others. This discussion around that question, I think, is going to be really important in the debates happening at the URC.
Thank you. And Natalia, we have a question from one of our viewers here who's asking, John knew him. He's asking, in the forthcoming conference in London, is it likely to produce some form of a new Marshall Plan? But perhaps you can also work that into your response to my next question for you also, and you can be fairly brief on this, but you alluded to the damage inflicted on energy infrastructure, which I think one of your recent reports you mentioned, it's estimated at $8.3 billion US. Since February 24th, Russia has, of course, launched over 1,400 missile and drones targeting Ukraine's energy, and the energy therefore remains a top priority for Ukraine. What are the immediate versus the long-term needs with regards to the energy sector?
So the first question on the London conference, if it can produce anything, and if there could be another Marshall Plan. So first, I think it's important to have expectations right. And, sometimes we wait that there will be one Marshall Plan, someone with the name Marshall, and it will be the document on everything. In fact, it looks more as a continuously evolving thinking and like a lot of documents and discussions that, growing and going into something more specific and reflecting the questions that international partners and investors are asking and what Ukrainian government and business want to say. So in this regard, from what I see and observe from the preparation to this, there would be an advancement on the thinking that was presented in Lugano. There will be much more details on how this fast recovery can look like, what's the approach to prioritizing, what are specific pilots and experiments that were already done where we can see some results. Also on the bigger recovery, there will be much more specific description of how investors and private sector can engage with Ukraine, what's meaningful, where the government can give support, how the funds can be structured. So it will be more specific. There is a lot of evolution of like how the civil society, think tanks here and think tanks abroad are approaching this, and the government will be more detailed and specific. So I have hopes that there will be a progress on this. On the other hand, I'm frankly frustrated with how this coordination works, because when we went to Lugano, there was a big question. Okay, why the coordination is so bad? Like how it's all gonna look? What's the financial Rammstein platform? After this, there were several attempts to establish such platform, and finally, at the end of the last year, there was established multi-donor platform with EU, US, and everyone from Ukrainian government, UK. But then we don't see any, specific reports, unlike, for example, with military Rammstein or with sanctions, where coordination is way, way better. So on the one hand, I'm much more positive. On the other hand, I'm kind of still a little bit like want more progress on how it's organizationally works. So the second question was about energy sector. So so even our estimates are made from public sources and our knowledge of the area for many years, but it's all top secret from the militarily angle. It all cannot be shared. So therefore, it's more difficult to speculate, about the needs. But I would try, and what we hear internally is that there is a big demand for all this, as last winter, all kind of spare parts for our current energy infrastructure, transformators, all this kind of stuff. But also for some solutions of the decentralized heating for people. And in the long term, I think it's more about wind, solar, hydrogen, and some of these projects can be actually run by small businesses. And I know some investors who are right now during the war are setting wind farms in the west of Ukraine, and the distance between these two objects of the wind farm is quite 2 meters or something. So you have to have so many rockets to make meaningful destruction that it doesn't make sense. So, and this is just an example that a lot of investment and business projects can be done right now. So, and then I think
Natalia, can I just ask you to pause for 1 second? I know Gavin has a hard stop, so I do want to ask him another question before he leaves, but that's super insightful. So our military factors are now being calculated into Ukraine's reconstruction efforts. Gavin, what are the main risks involved with the EFF? How can those risks be mitigated? And are there any opportunities for foreign companies to invest and support Ukraine's recovery? Thank you, Gavin.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lynn. I'll be very brief. If I could just first react to one of the points which Luke made. Now, of course, everyone would want to ensure that Ukrainian companies have their fair share of reconstruction activity. I think one should be very careful about establishing rules which makes that very explicit, bearing in mind that there are very powerful connected parties in Ukraine who could exploit this. So I think it needs to be, I think one has to be extremely careful from a governance perspective in thinking through that. On your question, Leon, this is really the first time, to my knowledge, the IMF has engaged in a program for a country in a situation of war. And we knew that from the get-go. And therefore, what we did in designing the program was to tackle head-on that risk. And so there are two scenarios under the program. We've approached, and the second scenario assumes a longer and more drawn-out war. And in all our conversations with the donors, we explained all this, and we secured undertakings that they would provide additional financing, because if the war talks last longer, the budget deficit will be larger for a longer period of time. That's the main issue. Of course, there are many other risks which are on the horizon, include those which came up on this conversation. I'd say I particularly highlight the Black Sea grain corridor, because for the reasons Natalia mentioned, agriculture is a crucial aspect of the economy, not just in terms of its impact on GDP, but its social impact. So I think it would be a major concern if the grain corridor was suspended, because it will affect sowing decisions for the future. It has a medium-term impact. So I think let me stop there. Thank you. And I apologize that I have to leave, but thank you very much for inviting me to a really interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Gavin, and feel free to just drop off and we'll touch base later. Thank you. Luke, let's quickly go back to you before we go to Natalia again. I don't know if you want to share with us some thoughts. We were in a discussion earlier this week on insourcing Ukraine's recovery, which is such a fundamental issue, I think, in terms of thinking about recovery, how Ukrainians, resources can be used for this particular purpose, and perhaps related to this issue also. What major lessons are there from Western IFI involvement in the region from the 80s and the 90s with regards to structural adjustment programs, because the IFIs, of course, play such a fundamental role. 60% of external debt now consists of borrowing from international financial institutions and governments. So maybe you could share some of your thoughts on those issues with us, Luke.
Yeah, so and it's interesting that Gavin indicated some concern around a preferential insourcing policy for Ukrainian companies. And I suppose that does reflect this concern that oligarchic interests will be ready to pounce to profit from it. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case if it's well designed. So yes, on the broader point that you raised around the legacy of IFI involvement in the post-communist countries since the 1990s. I mean, we're sort of living in some ways with the legacy of that very radical, very rapid restructuring that took place in many countries around the time of what was known as the Washington Consensus, the period of great belief in the power of unrestrained free markets. And I think what that tells us is that now we're moving away from those assumptions, including among IFIs, I think, where all of the discussion is about mobilizing revenue for public investment. In terms of, so that discussion has moved on a lot over the last 3 decades, and Ukraine, I think, needs to be in a good place to profit from this rethinking, because what I emphasized earlier about state failure, in market failure in conditions of war, those also confront us in other domains. I mean, war is a very extreme case, but the other crises that societies are facing all over the world, from the ecological crisis, from the COVID-19 pandemic, have generally created conditions where markets all over the world are becoming much, much more dependent on state activism. And of course, that state activism can serve oligarchic interests. So the job of Democrats and people who believe in democratic public authority is to build institutions which are well designed and are able to respond effectively to market failures in ways that protect the public interest. I think I agree with I agree with Natalia that of course we should be focusing in Reconstruction on the industries of the future. I know amongst Ukrainians there's a huge concern and criticism of the steel industries that have been destroyed. I mean, they were hideous and notorious polluters in Mariupol. I mean, some of the most environmentally damaging steel production in the world took place in Mariupol. It was really a negative picture. On the other hand, steel will be essential to the industries of the future. I mean, high-speed rail infrastructure is a good example where steel is necessary. And if you want to get people out of airplanes, we need to be investing there. So I think there's a mix of remedies that will be needed. And the question for Ukraine going forward is, can it build a state that protects the public interest effectively, has transparent public procurement, has a competition law that dismantles the oligarchic interests where it's necessary and right to do so, but also has a thriving and vibrant public sector that cleans up its state-owned enterprises and uses that investment in state-owned enterprises to deliver higher productivity and higher economic growth.
I think those are good benchmarks to measure any of these programs going forward. You know, in whose interest are they? And it comes back to the classic political economic question: we both know who benefits, right? Natalia, to close us off, maybe you could share with us your final thoughts on Ukraine's recovery. You know, we talked a little bit about who will finance it, who will pay for it. We haven't really discussed, you know, seizing Russian assets, which is a hot topic, of course, in Ukraine, and I know Ukrainians are also trying to promote this idea in other places outside of Ukraine. And maybe just very briefly, do Ukrainians foresee any role for China and India with regards to reconstruction? Thank you.
Oh, that's a difficult question at the end. So we definitely see Russia as a big contributor to the reconstruction, and it's just fundamentally correct thing. There could not be a proper Russia nor Ukraine without this accountability and justice taking place, including all the compensation to the people whose human rights were violated, to people whose property was damaged, to businesses, and to the government and public in general. So I think that's important for both of countries to live further. And in terms of China and India, that's a difficult question. For now, they don't show, I would say, symptoms of active engagement into the recovery process in Ukraine. Now it's more a question of them not supporting too much Russia in circumvention of sanctions and other things. However, I think Ukraine, after recovery, will be much more globally oriented country than it has been before the war, and will have much more diplomatic relations with all countries across the globe, and why not India and China, as long as you know, these countries support democratic development and human rights. I think our government currently demonstrate whatever can be demonstrated in diplomacy and willingness to build constructive relations with everyone who is on the good side of the history.
Thank you, Natalia, and I'd really like to thank all three of our speakers, Natalia Shapoval, Gavin Grant, and Dr. Luke Cooper, for your valuable insights and expertise regarding Ukraine's road to recovery. It's a lot of issues that I think we covered quite a fair amount of issues, and I don't even think we've touched on a small percentage of the issues that I think will be discussed in London. But hopefully, you know, you've left some of us with some good food for thought. I think together, let us focus our efforts on supporting Ukraine's recovery and rebuilding a future of stability, prosperity, and peace. To our audience, I'd like to also thank you for tuning in, and please join us on June 27th to focus on the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on Moldova. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.